The room was small and dimly lit, filled with the hum of old tape machines and the faint scent of musty film. It was the central cable office of Memphis, tucked away in a little house not far from the Memphian Theater. I had walked in, curious about a potential investment for Elvis, only to find a little old lady and a handful of movie tapes. She smiled warmly as she explained how the tapes were played over and over, reaching a handful of homes in the city. The cost to wire Elvis's neighborhood for cable, $1 million, and it might take a decade just to break even. Easy money, not exactly. We didn't pursue it further. But the next opportunity that came our way was different. FM radio was in its infancy, and many AM stations owned FM signals but weren't doing much with them. I saw the potential immediately. FM crystal clear stereo sound would eventually make it the preferred signal for music stations. When WHBQ decided to sell its FM signal, I pitched the idea to Elvis. He was interested with two conditions. I had to run the station, and his initials had to be in the call letters. We brainstormed names like WEP, WEEP, and WTCB, but the signal was sold before we could make an offer. It became WESI, an easy listening station, and the dream of a rockin' radio Elvis station was put on hold. While we were chasing these opportunities, the Colonel made a move that bothered me deeply. In March 1973, he finalized a deal with RCA. For a lump sum of $5,400,000, Elvis's entire master recording catalog from Hound Dog to Heartbreak Hotel to Suspicious Minds was sold back to the label. The money was a lot, and it gave Elvis the influx of easy cash he'd been seeking, but it felt wrong to me. All those amazing songs, all the memories they created, were now just a price tag. I tried to raise my concerns with the Colonel, but he shrugged it off. They're not making any money for Elvis. RCA giving us millions. George, that's like found money. Elvis, always the visionary, was also taking on new challenges. In January 1973, he performed the Aloha Show in Hawaii, the first ever worldwide satellite broadcast of a concert. Over 1 billion fans tuned in, and Elvis seemed excited about the event. But when I watched the U.S. broadcast, something felt off. He looked drawn and tired, and his performance lacked the spark we'd come to expect. The problems became more pronounced during his February engagement at the Hilton. Elvis missed several shows due to illness, and one night, 4 drunken fans climbed onto the stage. He spiraled into a rage, claiming they were hitmen sent by Priscilla's love interest, Mike Stone. Linda Thompson, now living at Graceland, was a steady presence in Elvis's life. She enjoyed the VIP lifestyle, but also found herself playing the role of a nurse or mother. Friends like Joe, Jerry, Red, and myself noticed his lapses but made excuses. He was just working too hard, or he needed to start working again, or he was reacting to a new medication. But sometimes there were no excuses. One uncomfortable incident at Graceland involved Billy Stanley, one of Dee Stanley's sons. Elvis, trying to offer marriage counseling, gave Billy and his wife a ring, and then took the wife for a ride on his motorcycle. When they returned, Elvis had a strange expression on his face and kept singing a line from a Holly song. "He ain't heavy, he's my brother." It felt out of character and sour. Music was always Elvis's refuge, and hopes were high for his return to recording. Sessions were booked at Stax, another legendary Memphis studio, but there wasn't the same magic as before. Elvis managed a few decent tracks, like If You Talk in Your Sleep and Promised Land, but nothing truly special. When he returned to Las Vegas for his August 1973 engagement, he received some of the worst reviews of his career. It was clear he was in a diminished state. Things came to a head when Elvis fired the Colonel, after a dispute over remarks made about the Hilton management. I was excited at the prospect of Elvis starting fresh with a new manager. But the Colonel, in a sharp negotiation, wore down Elvis and Vernon's resolve. Before long, Elvis and the Colonel were back to being client and manager. Elvis and Priscilla's separation was finalized not long after. Their divorce was surprisingly amicable. They left the Santa Monica courthouse arm in arm, looking more like a couple heading out to dinner than one ending a marriage. Elvis told Priscilla, "We met as friends and we part as friends. If you ever need anything, just call me. I'll always love you." Despite the separation, Elvis remained a doting father, doing whatever he could to be there for Lisa Marie. But in October 1973, Elvis's strength gave out. He was having trouble breathing and was checked into Baptist Memorial Hospital. It was a scary moment, but also a relief. His health had been declining, and the hospital stay was his chance to get healthy again. Elvis had a private room with a second bed for Linda, and a second room across the hall for the guys. He had his favorite foods delivered from Graceland, and would listen to music to pass the time. One visit, I brought him a portable record player and a stack of new albums. We listened to Charlie Rich's The Most Beautiful Girl over and over, and I couldn't help but feel that each time Elvis was thinking about Priscilla. Another visit, Elvis had some news for me. He had been helping Barbara and me look for a house, and he had even put down a deposit. But in the hospital, he had to tell me he couldn't follow through. "GK, you know my situation's changed. I can't get you that house at this time." I was disappointed, but knew it didn't mean much compared to everything he had done for me. "Elvis, I'm just glad you're getting better in here. I'd rather have a friend than a house." Outside the hospital, the world continued to spin. Inside, Elvis was facing his demons. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, he was taking it one step at a time. Elvis was back in the hospital, and this time he was looking much better. Dr. Nick managed to sort out the many medications Elvis had been taking and put him on a simpler, more controlled regimen. To help with the transition, Dr. Nick even started giving Elvis placebo pills. To keep Elvis active, Dr. Nick suggested racquetball. Elvis, who had never been a big exerciser, took to the sport, and soon we were booking courts all over Memphis for late-night matches. After his hospital stay, Elvis had a couple of months without any work, which was a first in years. When he finally got back to work for his January 1974 shows at the Las Vegas Hilton, he was in top form. I went to see him after my own big gig, where I had emceed a concert with Three Dog Night, Black Oak, Arkansas, and Buddy Miles. The event drew 25,000 people, and everyone in Memphis was asking why Elvis never performed in his hometown. I thought it was about time for a homecoming. The first night I was in Vegas, I found myself in Elvis's dressing room with the Colonel and Tom Diskin. I must have been feeling confident, because I told the Colonel that Elvis should book a show in Memphis. The Colonel, always the businessman, was worried about not selling out, but I was confident that Elvis could fill the Mid-South Coliseum. The Colonel didn't like my suggestion, but Elvis walked in just then, and the conversation stopped. Back in Memphis, I got a call from Bubba Bland, the manager of the Mid-South Coliseum. He told me that the Colonel had booked Elvis for 4 shows, and they sold out in just 8 hours. A 5th show was added, and it sold out too. The Colonel didn't need my guarantee after all. The shows in Memphis were amazing. The crowd was wild, and it felt like old time. We all realized that Elvis was human with his own struggles and mistakes, but watching him perform, I still felt a sense of awe. Elvis's trophy room at Graceland was a sight to see. It was filled with gold and platinum records, awards, and memorabilia. One day, some Hollywood bigwigs visited, and Elvis showed them around. When they got to the picture of his senior class from Humes High School, Elvis pointed to me. "Look who's up at the top of that picture," he said. "That's George Klein, the man standing beside me right now. George was president of our class and one of the few guys who was always kind to me." I was touched by his words, and I thanked him. With his health holding steady, Elvis decided to take on a new challenge: film producer. He wanted to make a documentary about karate, which had become popular in America. Jerry Schilling joined as a co-producer, and we started filming. One night, we shot nearly an hour of sequences with Elvis, and it was exciting to watch. A few months later, I went to Graceland to see a rough cut of the film. It was really good, but the project faced some problems. Elvis was feeling worn down again, and the production eventually shut down. Elvis's 40th birthday wasn't a happy one. He was not feeling well and ended up back in the hospital. When I visited, he talked about his will and even mentioned leaving me $50,000. I didn't want to hear about it and tried to change the subject. In March, Elvis returned to the Las Vegas Hilton. Barbara Streisand and visited him and offered him a role in her remake of A Star is Born. Elvis was excited, but the Colonel demanded a deal that Streisand's team couldn't accept, and the role went to Chris Christopherson. Elvis was disappointed but didn't give up. He bought a Convair 880 jet, which he named the Lisa Marie, and we started talking about his first overseas tours. One night, Elvis decided that we both needed facelifts. I argued against it, but he was determined. We ended up getting mini facelifts, and Elvis was happy with the results. He always wanted to look his best, but he didn't rely on anything but his natural showmanship in his performances. One day, an old friend named Chickaboo Patton showed me a new technology called a hologram. He used a contraption with glass prisms to create 3D images that seemed to float in the air. It was fascinating, and I wondered how Elvis might use it in his shows. But for now, he was focused on his music and his fans. Chickaboo had an idea for a new trick for Elvis. He could use a big, fancy machine to make it look like Elvis was floating above the crowd and then disappearing. It would cost a lot of money, about $75,000. I thought it might be a cool addition to Elvis's show, and I knew how much he loved trying new things. I talked to Jerry Schilling about it, and he thought it was pretty neat too. So one night after we played racquetball with Elvis, I told him about the idea. I explained everything to Elvis, including how much it would cost. But Elvis didn't like the idea. Hologram holo shit. What are you talking about, GK? I've never used a gimmick in my act, and I'm not going to start now, he said. Elvis didn't want to use tricks in his shows. He wanted the performances to be real and genuine. Outside of his own concerts, Elvis loved going to football games at the Liberty Bowl in Memphis. In the summer of 1974, Memphis got a new football team called the Southmen, but everyone called them the Grizzlies. The team was owned by John Bassett, a really nice guy. I knew John from around town, and he asked if Elvis might come to a game. Elvis was excited about it, so we went to the opening game of the 1974 season. Elvis and his group were guests in John Bassett's private skybox. The next year, in 1975, the Grizzlies got some big NFL players Larry C., Sanka, Paul Warfield, and Jim Keek, who were all part of the 1972 Super Bowl champion Miami Dolphins. For the opening game, Elvis rented a city bus to take his group to the stadium. We arrived just as the national anthem was being sung. Charlie Rich, a famous singer, was performing it, but he had some trouble and messed up a couple of lines. As we were heading to the skybox, we met Charlie in the elevator. Elvis and Charlie were old friends, and they had a nice chat. "That's a tough song to sing," Elvis said. "It sure is," Charlie replied. "That's why I haven't done it. I've been asked, but I keep saying no," Elvis laughed. Elvis and Charlie talked a bit more, and just before we got off the elevator, Elvis said, "Charlie, I'm glad the rest of the world has finally found out what I've known for a long time." "What's that, Elvis?" Charlie asked. "That Charlie Rich is one hell of a singer." Charlie looked really happy, like Elvis had given him a medal. I was supposed to MC the halftime show, and I asked Joe Esposito if it was okay to introduce Elvis. Joe said no because he didn't want the crowd to get too excited and cause a problem, but Elvis overheard us and told me to go ahead. So during the halftime show, I introduced Elvis, and he leaned out of the skybox to wave to the crowd. Everyone went wild. After the game, Elvis leaned over to me and said, "GK, why don't you go to Hawaii?" "Go to Hawaii?" I asked. "Yeah, Hanmi, you always use up your vacation time to come to where I am. I want to treat you and Barbara to a trip to Hawaii." "Elvis, are you serious?" I asked. "Yeah, I'm serious," he said. Elvis loved giving gifts, and I knew how much it meant to him. So I said yes. The next Saturday, we went back to another Grizzlies game. After the game, we went out for a movie and then headed back to Graceland. It was late, but Elvis wasn't ready to go to bed. He wanted to fly all of us to Dallas to see the progress on his new jet, the Lisa Marie. I was hesitant because I had a DJ gig the next night, but I agreed to go, and we all flew to Dallas around 4 in the morning. Elvis showed us the plane, which still needed work but looked amazing. As we were getting ready to leave, Elvis said, "We're going to Palm Springs." I was upset because I had a show to do. "Palm Springs? You told me we'd go back home." "I told you I have a show, it's important to me, Elvis." "Don't worry about it," Elvis said. I felt like I was just an inconvenience to him. "What do you mean, don't worry? I need to go to work, Elvis. And nobody brought a bag, nobody's ready to go to Palm Springs." We'll get everything you need in Palm Springs. We'll party until morning, and then the jet will fly you back to Memphis in time for the show," he said. I was frustrated. "That's $5,000 for what?" "If you really have to go to Palm Springs, I'll stay here and catch an early flight back for $75. "Fine, I don't care what you do," Elvis said and walked away. I didn't have any cash, so the group collected money for me to get a room and a flight back to Memphis. I spent the night in Dallas, flew back to Memphis, picked up my car, and did my show. I was really tired, but I made it through. Elvis and the group went to Palm Springs and didn't get back to Memphis until Wednesday. When I saw Elvis again at Graceland, I expected we might talk about what happened. But Elvis didn't like confrontations, and neither did I. I started to bring it up, but he shook his head and said, "We had a good time, GK. You should have been there." It wasn't much of a reconciliation, but we let it go and moved on. A few days later, Barbara and I went to Las Vegas to see Elvis's show. He still had an amazing stage presence, but he seemed really tired. I didn't want to be a critic, so after the show I told him, "You knocked them out, Elvis." Elvis was in great shape, but he was also going through some tough times. He was in and out of the hospital a lot, and Dr. Nick was trying to help him with his health. Dr. Nick's nurse, Tish Henley, and other nurses started taking care of Elvis at Graceland. They gave him his medication and made sure he was okay. Nurse Cock was older and became like a surrogate aunt to Elvis. He really liked her back rubs and conversations. Elvis's health problems were serious, but there was a sadder event that reminded us how much worse things could be. Jackie Wilson, a famous singer, had a heart attack on stage and fell, hitting his head. He ended up in a long-term care facility. Elvis was really worried about Jackie and asked me to call the hospital every week to make sure Jackie was getting the best care. I became friends with the nurses, and we made sure Jackie's room always had fresh flowers, candy, and magazines for his visitors. Elvis finally got his new jet, the Lisa Marie, in November 1975. He hoped it would make it easier to do international shows, but Colonel Parker didn't seem interested in that. At the end of 1975, Elvis decided to make up for canceled shows by performing at the Las Vegas Hilton for the first 2 weeks of December. It was usually a slow time in Las Vegas, but Elvis sold out every show and set new box office records. The shows weren't his best, but they were solid, and it was good to see him doing well. Back in Memphis, football was on everyone's mind. The city had lost the Memphis Grizzlies to the World Football League, which folded in 1975. But the NFL was planning to add some new teams, and a local sports entrepreneur named Mike Lynn was working hard to bring an NFL franchise to Memphis. He needed to make a strong presentation to the NFL owners, and he thought Elvis Presley could be the key to wowing them. Lynn approached me, knowing I had a connection to Elvis. He wanted to offer Elvis 5 or 6% ownership of the team in exchange for Elvis acting as a goodwill ambassador and schmoozing the NFL owners. I presented the offer to Elvis at Graceland, and he was excited about it. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," Elvis said. "I want it." Elvis called Colonel Parker, his manager, to discuss the offer, but the colonel was against it. He warned Elvis that the NFL would expect him to sing the national anthem for free and perform at the Super Bowl. "We're entertainers, not a halftime show," the colonel said. Elvis's interest waned, and he declined the offer. Memphis didn't get an NFL team that year. Elvis and his ex-wife, Priscilla, stayed in touch. She often visited Las Vegas to see his shows and was concerned about his health. One time, Lisa Marie, Elvis's daughter, visited Graceland. I decided to surprise her with a little fun. I put on a Planet of the Apes mask and a black raincoat, then walked into the room like a zombie. I introduced myself as Igor the Monster. Lisa just smiled and looked at me, and Elvis laughed, saying, "Now I've got the only kid in the world with her own personal monster." Linda Thompson was a close friend and companion to Elvis, but she was focused on her acting career in Los Angeles, where Elvis had leased an apartment for her. One day, Elvis asked me to find him a date. I set him up with Tori Petty, a beauty queen from Mississippi. Elvis started seeing her often, which upset Linda. One night, Linda answered the gold-plated phone in Elvis's bedroom and found out about Tori. She was furious and blamed me. I told her it was Elvis's decision, but the incident strained our friendship. Linda and Elvis grew apart, but they remained good friends. Meanwhile, some of Elvis's close friends were leaving. Jerry Schilling quit after a ski trip, where Elvis's moods and demands made things tense. Joe Esposito was spending more time in Los Angeles. Old friends like Richard Davis, Alan Fortes, Marty Lacker, and Lamar Fike were pursuing their own careers. In July, Elvis's father, Vernon, fired Red and Sonny West, along with Dave Hebler. I was shocked. These guys had been with Elvis for a long time, and Red had been his friend since high school. The firings felt cold, especially since Elvis wasn't even in town when they happened. I hoped Elvis would bring them back, but he didn't. Around this time, the TV show Talent Party ended after 12 years. I went back to focusing on my radio show, and big changes were happening in both our lives. One night, Elvis and I were at the Memphian Theater, watching a movie. A luxurious white limo appeared on screen, and Elvis was smitten. "I want that car," he said. Joe Esposito tracked down the car, which was in Los Angeles, and Elvis bought it. Within days, the limo was parked at Graceland. RCA wanted Elvis to record new songs, so they set up a recording studio at Graceland. Elvis recorded some great tracks, like Moody Blue and Hurt. But during the second session, he couldn't get into the right frame of mind. The sessions ended early, and Elvis made sure the musicians got home in style. He even gave the Stamps vocal group his new white limo. Despite his health issues, Elvis worked hard in 1976, with 8 concert tours and a Las Vegas engagement. Dr. Nick, his doctor, was trying to help him stay healthy. Elvis got interested in racquetball as a way to stay fit. He built a beautiful court at Graceland, and even considered turning it into a recording studio. Elvis talked to Red West again, who was planning to write a tell-all book with Sonny and Dave. They had been fair to Elvis, and he wanted to support them, but the book deal made things complicated. Elvis would have liked to hire them back, but it didn't happen. At the end of 1976, Linda Thompson left for Los Angeles again. Elvis felt lonely, and asked me to help him meet some new people. I called up guests from Talent Party, and other women around town. Elvis was always looking for new friends and experiences, even as his world was changing. The weeks passed, and I found myself acting as a sort of matchmaker for Elvis. Almost every night, he had a date, usually at Graceland. It was a bit strange, but it felt good to be trusted by him to pick girls he'd be comfortable with. Elvis never wanted to know the details of my relationships with these girls, even though they were all platonic. I was close enough to many of them to hear about their nights with Elvis. They all said he was a perfect gentleman, and most of them wondered when they could see him again. Some even left personal items behind, like a sweater or a purse, hoping for a return visit. Elvis often just wanted to sit and talk with his dates. He was great at conversation, and he seemed to enjoy it more than anything. Sometimes he just wanted the feeling of being with someone laughing and making each other laugh. Physical intimacy didn't seem to be his main goal, but with a beautiful woman in his bed, things could get heated. One of the girls I introduced to Elvis was Gail Stanton, a stunning Playboy model. When I asked her about her night, she said it was great, and they joked around all night. Elvis told me we almost broke the damned bed. Elvis was going through the women I knew pretty quickly, but I had limits. He wasn't interested in lowering his standards or in just physical encounters. This became clear when I emceed a concert in Chicago. Backstage, I met a famous groupie named Sweet Connie. She approached me, thinking I could get her to Elvis. She offered her services, but I politely declined, knowing that wasn't what Elvis wanted. I was running out of options when I remembered Terry Alden, a Miss Tennessee I'd met on a TV show. I invited her to a party at Graceland, and she asked if she could bring her 2 sisters. When they arrived, I was surprised to see that Terry's younger sister, Ginger, was even more beautiful than Terry. I knew Elvis would be smitten. I called him upstairs and described Ginger. He was skeptical, but agreed to meet them. When they came upstairs, Elvis's eyes lit up when he saw Ginger. We worked out a plan where I'd give Terry and her sister, Rosemary, a tour of the house, while Elvis spent time with Ginger. The night went well, and by 3 in the morning, everyone had left except us and the Alden sisters. Terry asked me to check on Ginger, who hadn't come out of Elvis's room. I called up, and Elvis said they were talking about his books and weren't ready to say goodnight. He drove Ginger home in one of his limos at sunrise and told me he was crazy about her. Elvis wanted Ginger to accompany him on his last tour of the year, but there was a complication. Linda Thompson, his ex, had expected to go with him. She left, and it was clear it was for good. Elvis went to Las Vegas for a show, and I joined him for the opening weekend. His performances were strong, and it was obvious he was trying to impress Ginger. One night after a show, we were walking to Elvis's suite when a guy with a camera jumped out and asked to take Elvis's picture. Security tackled him, but Elvis told them to let him go. He explained that the guy had asked politely and deserved a chance. Elvis then posed for a private photo session, showing how much he appreciated his fans. Elvis's career had its challenges, and he seemed bored with his current routine. He needed an artistic challenge and rest. But there were times when I worried about his mental state. He told me stories about going on drug busts with Denver police, even claiming he had killed a suspect with a karate chop. I didn't question it, thinking it was just a side effect of his medication. Another time, he wanted me to set up a drug buy so he could make an arrest. I called the number, but the deal never went through. I dismissed these incidents as medication side effects, but now I see they were signs of deeper problems. Elvis's health continued to decline. His shows were getting weaker, and he was admitted to Baptist Memorial Hospital again. His body was bloated from gastrointestinal issues, and his overuse of medication made surgery too risky. I talked to Dr. Nick about getting Elvis into rehab, but Elvis refused. Vernon and the Colonel didn't push for it either. Elvis needed rest, but he was back on the road just a couple of weeks after leaving the hospital. By the summer of 1977, I had my own troubles to worry about. I was facing federal charges for mail fraud. It all started when a mailman who played on our station's softball team offered to sell some empty Arbitron ratings books. These books were used to track what radio stations people listened to. The books were supposed to be filled out by listeners and sent back to the company. The mailman claimed that some people on his route didn't want to fill them out, so he had them. The station thought it was a lucky break and asked me to fill out a few. I did, thinking it wasn't a big deal. But it turned out the mailman had stolen the books, and he had tried to sell them to a competing station before us. That station reported him to the post office, and the Postal Service took the case seriously. When the investigation started, I cooperated fully and admitted to filling out the books. I was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit mail fraud, and I lost my job at WHBQ. I felt lost and depressed, and there was only one person I could turn to: Elvis. I went to Graceland, and Elvis greeted me like it was any other day. But as soon as I started talking, everything poured out. I told him about the charges, the investigation, and how I was hoping a lawyer could keep me out of jail. Elvis put a hand on my shoulder and said, "They'll never put you in jail as long as I'm alive." Elvis couldn't have been more supportive. He promised to take care of me no matter what, and said he would hire the best lawyers to defend me. If it came to it, he even said he would put me on his plane, the Lisa Marie, and fly me out of the country. He was so worked up about helping me that he suddenly went silent and then said, "Billy, get President Carter on the phone." Billy, Elvis's cousin, was stumped. But I knew the main White House switchboard number, so I gave it to him. Billy called and a security guard answered. He left a message, and the next day he called the local FBI office to see if they could help. That afternoon, the phone rang at Graceland, and it was Chip Carter, the president's son. Chip wanted to speak to Elvis, but Elvis said the matter was private and could only be discussed with the president. Amazingly, Chip agreed to have his father call back. The next day, the president called. Elvis answered the phone and said, "No, this ain't Billy, it's his cousin Elvis." He and President Carter had a conversation, and Elvis told him about my legal troubles. The president sounded willing to look into the matter. Despite that, my case kept moving forward, and I started to accept that I might have to face a court date. Around the same time, a book by Red and Sonny West and Dave Hebler was about to be released. It was an unflattering look at Elvis's private life, and he was upset about it. I started visiting Graceland more often. It was the only place where I could relax and forget my worries. Elvis was going through his own issues, but he always let me in. Elvis had a month at home before his next tour. He and Ginger spent a lot of time together. One night, Elvis called and asked if I had a copy of the song, Angelica. He wanted Ginger to hear it, and was thinking about recording it himself. I brought the song over, and it was a special moment. With my radio career uncertain, I started doing some freelance work at Libertyland, a theme park. One Sunday in August, Billy called and said Elvis wanted to rent the park for the night. He wanted to treat Lisa and Ginger to a private night out. We made all the arrangements, but Elvis changed his mind and canceled. Then, just before closing time, he changed his mind again. I managed to get a few staff members back, and we had a wonderful night. Elvis looked like a little kid again, and Lisa seemed to enjoy it just as much as we did. We reminisced about a night 20 years earlier when we came to the fairgrounds in Elvis's new '56 Cadillac Eldorado. The car was purple with a white interior, and we dressed up to match. We drove right onto the fairgrounds and used the car to get around. It started raining, and Elvis's suit started shrinking. The rain turned into a downpour, and we got the car all muddy. When we got back to Graceland, Elvis's father was furious, and it took a lot of work to clean the car. Just before we left the park, Elvis reminded me of a mistake I used to make on my TV show. I thought Don't Be Cruel with Hound Dog as the B-side was his biggest selling record, but Elvis corrected me. He said It's Now or Never sold 14 million copies. On August 16th, I was working at Libertyl, and when I got a call from a DJ friend, he said Elvis had passed away. I thought it was a joke. More calls came in, and I started to feel uneasy. I called Graceland, and Sandy, Vernon's girlfriend, answered. She said it was true. I felt like I had been stabbed. I drove to Graceland as fast as I could, praying it was a mistake. The news was everywhere, but I didn't want to believe it. When I got to Graceland, the room was full of people crying. Lisa looked devastated. Vernon was crying uncontrollably. He hugged me and said, "We've lost him, George, we've lost him." I started crying too. Elvis, the boy I met at Humes High, the kid who sang Old Shep to our music class, the guy who welcomed me into his life, my best man, my best friend, he was gone. The days after Elvis's death were a blur of tears and shock. I felt numb, as if I were floating above everything that was happening. At Graceland, the house was filled with people who had been close to Elvis Priscilla: Jerry, Joe, Charlie Hodge, Alan Fortas, Felton Jarvis, Richard Davis, Sam Phillips. We all wore our grief like a heavy coat, and the familiar faces that once brought joy now only reminded us of our loss. The night before he died, Elvis had gone to see Dr. Lester Hoffman, a dentist I had introduced him to back in 1957. He got some fillings done, and then returned to Graceland to play racquetball with Billy Smith. After the game, he sat at the piano in the racquetball building and played some of his favorite songs, including Blue Eyes Cryin' in the Rain. Later, he went upstairs to his bedroom with Ginger and took some of the medications Dr. Nick had prescribed. When Ginger woke up the next afternoon, she found Elvis on the floor of his private bathroom, lifeless. Despite all the efforts to save him, it was too late. His body was too weak, and he was gone at the age of 42. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, decided to allow a public viewing at Graceland because of the tens of thousands of fans who came to pay their respects. There was also a private viewing in the Graceland living room for friends and family. One of the first calls I received was from James Brown, who was devastated and wanted to come to the house. I checked with Priscilla, and she said it was okay. James arrived later that afternoon, and I could see how truly heartbroken he was. We stood silently by the casket, and then he sat quietly in the corner of the living room for a long time before joining the other mourners. On the evening of the second day, I got a call from the gate saying Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, wanted to pay her respects. Elvis and his family had supported JFK, so her visit felt like royalty had arrived. I introduced her to Priscilla, who took her to meet Grandma Presley. Caroline was very kind to the family, and her visit meant a lot to us. However, a month later, we were shocked to learn that Caroline had written a detailed account of her visit for Rolling Stone magazine, which had Elvis on the cover. At one point, Jerry Schilling and I needed a break from the grief, so we went downstairs to the TV room. This room, where we had so many wonderful times, only made the loss feel even greater. I looked at the TV, the record player, and the ice cream bar things that had brought Elvis so much joy, and I ended up crying harder than I had upstairs. The service at Graceland was held 2 days after Elvis's death. Afterward, I was one of the pallbearers who carried his casket out to a white hearse. The hearse led a long line of white limousines carrying all of us who were closest to Elvis. As we drove out of Graceland, the sight of the massive crowd lining the road was both heart-wrenching and beautiful. People from all walks of life were there, paying their final tribute to a man who had touched their lives in so many ways. Charlie Hodge, always the comedian, tried to lighten the mood with his jokes, but our laughter would quickly turn to sobs. We'd compose ourselves, watch the crowd, and then Charlie would say something else, and the cycle would repeat. At the cemetery, we had another service, and the pallbearers carried the casket to the mausoleum. I stood at the front right position, kissed my hand, touched it to the casket, and said goodbye. In the days after the funeral, we noticed many strange occurrences. Priscilla had a premonition of loss before she heard the news. In Los Angeles, a drought ended with a rainstorm the moment Jerry Schilling heard about Elvis's death. Linda Thompson's power went out when she heard the news, and the sound went out on the TV broadcast of the news at Graceland. A tree limb fell on Ginger Alden's car as we carried the casket out of Graceland, and tapes of Elvis's music jammed or broke. These coincidences seemed almost supernatural, and I couldn't help but think Elvis would have found them amusing. None of the Memphis Mafia members were included in Elvis's will. Lisa Marie was the sole heir, with provisions for the care of Vernon and Grandma Minnie. Some in the group were upset, but I never felt it was worth dwelling on. I had received so much from Elvis while he was alive that I didn't need or expect anything more. After Elvis's death, I followed the Jewish tradition of Yahrzeit, a year of mourning marked by daily prayers. I didn't wear the diamond ring Elvis had given me, and I avoided listening to his music. Those reminders were too painful. The years after Elvis's death were tough. My marriage to Barbara ended in divorce, and my mother passed away. I also faced legal troubles, including charges of mail fraud, which led to a few months in jail. Slowly, I rebuilt my career, working as a freelancer, doing voice-over work and DJing at nightclubs and private parties. Knox Phillips, Sam Phillips's son, called me to work at a new radio station. The station's call letters were WLVS, and they wanted me to host a show dedicated to Elvis. I began the Elvis Hour, and I've been doing it every Saturday for the past 30 years. Over time, I learned to see my memories of Elvis not as painful reminders, but as my most cherished possessions. I became passionate about promoting and protecting his legacy. I spoke about him all over the world, and discovered that talking about my memories could be fun. A turning point came when I appeared on Oprah Winfrey's show. Oprah asked me if I had ever competed with Elvis for a girl. I said, "Oprah, are you kidding? Elvis's second and third choices were better than my firsts. He didn't have any competition from me." The audience burst into laughter, and I realized that remembering Elvis didn't have to be solemn. It could be a celebration. My relationships with the people around Elvis changed, but some friendships remained strong. I grew closer to Vernon Presley, and I still cherish my friendships with Priscilla, Jerry Schilling, Joe Esposito, Dr. Nick, Scotty Moore, and Charlie Hodge. Even my relationship with Red West, which had been strained by his book, eventually healed. Red apologized to me and the others, and we welcomed him back as a friend, knowing that Elvis would have wanted us to. Colonel Parker, always a complex figure, was a bizarre presence at Graceland after Elvis's death. He wore loud, Hawaiian print shirts, and ran around taking care of business arrangements. Years later, we learned that he was a Dutch immigrant who had never secured a U.S. passport, which explained his reluctance to support Elvis's international tours. One day, the colonel offered to drive me to the airport in Las Vegas, which was shocking because he never did such things. We just talked, and I left wondering if he ever felt truly lonely. In 1986, I received a great honor. Elvis Presley Enterprises asked me to accept the award on Elvis's behalf when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The event was held at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and it was a moving tribute to the legends who had created rock and roll. Elvis was introduced by John Lennon's sons, Sean and Julian. As I stood on stage, I was overwhelmed with emotion, realizing once again how much Elvis meant to so many people. By then, I had accepted that Elvis was gone, but I knew that his legacy would live on. Every time I host the Elvis Hour, I feel a connection to the man who brought so much joy into my life. Even though he's no longer here, I carry his memory with me, and I'm grateful for every moment we shared. As the years have gone by, I've kept close to the heart of Elvis Presley, a man who was not just a friend but a legend. Every August, I return to Memphis for Elvis Week, where I've shared so many unforgettable moments. I host a Memphis Mafia reunion at Alfred's on Beale, and for 3 decades, I've produced the memorial ceremonies that honor Elvis. One year, Muhammad Ali was the keynote speaker. His handshake was huge, but it was his heartfelt words and impromptu rendition of "Don't Be Cruel" that really moved the crowd. For the past few years, I've been hosting a weekly radio show on Sirius's Elvis channel from a studio at Graceland's Exhibition Center. I still find it hard to visit Graceland itself, but I do it for special events, trying to keep my emotions in check. It's a peaceful place, but every visit reminds me how much I miss Elvis. I've been lucky to find a new love in my life, my wife Dara. She's my rock, and I couldn't have carried on without her. She's a big Elvis fan too, which makes everything even more special. Shortly after Elvis died, Felton Jarvis told me about a song he and Elvis had planned to record. It was called "Loving You's a Natural Thing," and Elvis didn't know I had cowered in it. Felton played it for Elvis, and he loved it so much that he wanted to record it. Sadly, that never happened, but I like to imagine how excited he would have been to surprise me with a copy of him singing my song. In 2007, during the 30th anniversary of Elvis's death, I was at the FedEx Forum in Memphis for a tribute concert. It was a magical evening. The concert started with a film sequence where Elvis, played by a skilled impersonator, arrived by helicopter. I delivered the line, "It's time to rock and roll," and the real concert began with giant screen film clips of Elvis backed by the TCB band. The crowd's reaction was incredible. For a moment, it felt like Elvis was back. I think about Elvis every day. I'm proud that my music note on Memphis's Walk of Fame sits next to his on Beale Street. His music has been passed down through generations, and it still has the same energy and excitement. Elvis was more than just a musician. He was a movie star, a TV presence, and an incredible entertainer. But what really lives on is his voice, which can still give you goosebumps. Elvis had a sad ending, but he loved being who he was. He loved his fans, his life on the road, and making his dreams come true. He often said he couldn't wait to see what the next day would bring in the life of Elvis Presley. Elvis was the most talented, generous, and smartest man I've ever known, but what I loved most was his friendship. He made me feel cared for, supported, and accepted. I hope he knew how much I loved him and appreciated everything he did for me. There'll never be another Elvis, and there'll never be another person like him in my life. I feel lucky to say that Elvis Presley was my friend. I won't say goodbye to Elvis. But just like at the end of my radio shows, I can send you back to what lives on his music. Ladies and gentlemen, the sun never sets on a legend, and there'll always be a TCB on the Lisa Marie. The United States of America has had many presidents, but only one king, and here he is to sing. Thank you, Elvis, for everything.